Back on the right stand with the focus now firmly on the Five Eyes nations. We are also going to ask our next set of guests how they interpret the situation unfolding in Canada, the equations between Canada and India, and more importantly, did the Five Eyes allow this K goons and this K business to proliferate under their watchful eyes? Did they turn a blind eye to it? Or did they not understand the dimensions that it could undertake or take if, under the garb of freedom of expression, this was allowed? Joining us this evening, two former ministers in the Canadian government. We have Mr. Peter MacKay and also Ujjal Dosanjh, perhaps the first minister in government in Canada of Indian origin. And we also have Professor Ian Hall from Australia, giving us a wider, broader perspective on this entire matter. Namaste. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for joining us. My question to Mr. Peter MacKay. Mr. MacKay, thank you for speaking with us. My first question is, has Justin Trudeau provided anything beyond credible allegations in what he has said in the Canadian Parliament?
No, not to my knowledge. In fact, it's not been about evidence at all. The words that Mr. Trudeau used, interestingly, were credible allegations. And allegations, in my experience as a lawyer, as a former prosecutor in Canada, are insufficient even to lay a charge, let alone bring about a conviction. And let's not forget, in the context of this case, that this is an open murder investigation. Nobody has been charged. And as far as we know, we don't have suspects. That's really the crux of the issue, which makes it so bizarre that a head of state would have made such a damning statement about another country's government.
You've been in government, you're the political opposition today. Why would the Prime Minister of a nation say what he said and do what he did, especially drive a wedge between two friendly nations based on credible allegations?
Well, that's a very difficult question to answer. I don't know why this allegation was made. Presumably, there were some signal intelligence and human intelligence shared with our Prime Minister. And yet the normal protocol, in my experience, would have been to pursue this through diplomatic channels. We do know that the Prime Minister met with Narendra Modi, his counterpart in India, at the G20 some 2 weeks ago, and made the allegation then and was rebuffed and was told that it was absurd and not true. And then we see what has happened since.
Mr. MacKay, we have on record confirmation and also intel sources within the government of India confirming to us here at CNN News 18 that intelligence has been shared with the Canadians time and again. The Canadian NSA has been apprised of our concerns of the presence of gangsters, criminals, extremist elements on Canadian soil who are working against the interest of India, working to balkanize our country. But nothing has been done. Have these details been shared by the current government in Parliament or outside with the opposition?
My understanding, and I followed the case just through our news reporting, was that only the statement that was made in Parliament was the juxt of what was shared with the leader of the opposition, Mr. Poilievre. And so what took place between our security forces, those of Canada and India, is again unknown. But presumably, as you've laid it out, there would have been a request made for evidence and a willingness, I suspect, to cooperate if the suspects were in fact on Indian soil. Similarly, I know that requests have been made in the past for Canada to be more proactive in the treatment of individuals who were openly making statements that were not just offensive to the Indian government and the Modi government in particular, but that were presumably advocating violence. And that can't be permitted in a rule of law system. It's hate crime, it's inciting violence, and whether it's against citizens of your own country or other countries, it's not permitted under the rule of law.
Mr. MacKay, back in 2017, if I remember the date, sometime around 25th of February 2017, our channel put out pictures of Hardeep Nijjar with an AK-47 in Canada, somewhere in British Columbia amongst the hills. AK-47 is outlawed in Canada. Why is it that the Trudeau government did not take an action, especially when Canadian laws had been violated? There was a Red Corner Interpol notice against him too at that time. There was nothing that's been done. Why this soft peddling of extremists and this treating them with gloved hands or cotton wool?
Well, and I'm very uncomfortable hearing that repeated, and I know it. I know that you're not saying this in isolation. This evidence, at least media coverage and other information that I'm aware of, points to exactly what you've said: activities that are criminal, not just intolerable and going against the Canadian values and the Indian values, but that would be criminal behavior. Why the police haven't acted, why arrests were not made of Nijjar and others, is to me baffling. And clearly this has escalated to the point where this murder has occurred. I also want to add to the fact, and one of the other curiosities is how Mr. Nijjar arrived in Canada in the first place. He was refused a Canadian passport at least twice. And there is still some murky circumstance on how he arrived in Canada. He gave false information the first time he applied. It appears to have been an arranged marriage the second time, which was not accepted by Canadian immigration. And so I suspect strongly there is much more to come with respect to this story that may shed light on why he was allowed to continue with certain activities that, at least on the surface, appear to have been criminal behavior.
Ripudaman Malik, an accused in the IC 182 1985 episode, was murdered on Canadian soil. Justin Trudeau said it did nothing. Sukhdeep Dunek has been murdered after Hardeep Nijjar. Nothing's been said. These are all criminal elements, including Hardeep Nijjar. Goldie Brar is there. Arsh Dalla is there. How are these elements entering Canada?
Well, it's very troubling, and I worry a great deal as a citizen and a former member of government that we have been far too lax when it comes to following the evidence, when it comes to working with our trusted allies, which is often how we're able to preempt the entry of unwanted elements and individuals coming into our country. We have to rely and trust with one another when it comes to how we fight transnational crime. And of course, this isn't limited only to Canada, India. This, of course, is many countries, Mexican cartels. We know that there are undesirables from Iran, for example, who launder money here, who come here. We've lived through in recent days Chinese interference allegations in our electoral system and intimidation of Canadians of Chinese origin. And so this is a growing problem that requires more resources potentially for the police and action that brings perpetrators to justice. But making a political issue of this and making what appear to be so far unsubstantiated allegations, this hinders our ability to hold people to account and to bring about criminal prosecutions and ultimately the arrest and removal from society of those who are posing the threat.
The next elections are nearly 2 years away, but do you see a change in the leadership amongst the Liberals or elections earlier than the next 2 years?
Yes, it is possible. The Liberal government of Mr. Trudeau is propped up by an NDP partner, a smaller party that has formed a coalition for supply, as it's called, to keep the government in power. That decision to pull back from that agreement rests solely with the leader of the NDP and his party, and could happen potentially as soon as the new year. Mr. Trudeau himself may decide that he is going to step down and may be encouraged to do that by members of his own party. And so there are moving parts, so to speak, not only in this case involving Mr. Nijjar and the reaction that it has had around the world, but internally within the Liberal Party, a decision may be taken that Mr. Trudeau has to go.
Ujjalji, if somebody understands Canada in and out from an Indian perspective and an Indo-Canadian perspective, it's got to be you, because you are one of the first to represent the Indian diaspora in Canadian politics and in government. Let me ask you this, sir. How do you read the current situation?
Well, current situation is tense between India and Canada. I think Prime Minister Trudeau needs to provide some evidence, and Indians are clamoring for that evidence. Um, and and Prime Minister Trudeau may have many constraints on him. One is that some of this evidence may have come from the Five Eyes, some of the other countries that are allies of Canada. And there might be some constraints vis-a-vis what stage the prosecution, the investigation is at, what stage the police are at, whether or not there might be charges coming, and one doesn't want to jeopardize a continuing investigation. And, you know, he's placed himself in a very difficult situation because I believe, in fact, the public truth is that he made this statement to preempt a story in the Globe and Mail, the major newspaper in Canada. And now, in fact, he is now constrained by other issues so that he's not able to share the evidence if he has substantial evidence. I mean, he says he has. I have no doubt, no reason to doubt the Prime Minister of a country. But that's where, so we're at kind of a bit of a standstill. And this may continue for a while until the dust clears on the investigation.
Ujjalji, the cops haven't filed an FIR. There are no names of suspects that have been released. It's credible reasons and credible allegations. Are these grounds enough for a Justin Trudeau to drive a wedge in the relations between two vibrant democracies?
Well, it's saddening for me, both as a Canadian and as an Indian by heritage and birth. But I think that we are where we are, and it is cooled a relationship that was already in somewhat of a freeze, and it's going to take a long time. And all one can say, sitting outside of these, government circles on either side, all one can say is, let's be patient. I mean, he's made the accusation. He's made the allegation against India. India is seeking evidence, and I see stories in the Indian press saying Mr. Trudeau has provided no evidence other than what he has publicly said. And that makes it difficult. There's no question. And there's a lack of trust between the two countries right now. Partly it stems from Mr. Trudeau's, public dalliances with the Khalistani sympathizers right from the moment of his leadership campaign. He's been surrounded by people who have supported Khalistan in the past. Whether they presently support Khalistan or not is a different issue. And his government is underpinned in Parliament by the likes of Jagmeet Singh and his party. And Jagmeet Singh is a well-known Khalistani sympathizer, if not a Khalistani himself. I mean, I have seen videos of him circulating on YouTube long before he became the leader, where somebody said, one, that he and some other people went into Canadian politics to litigate 1984. He didn't say that. Somebody else was alleged to have said that. And I have seen some videos where he has spoken at Sikh sovereignty conferences. Obviously, sovereignty means an independent country. And therefore, one can say that simply muddles the whole issue for Indians who look at it from a distance. And I can understand that. I think many Canadians who pay attention to politics would understand that.
One would understand if it was limited to Canada only, Ujjalji, but if you look at the Five Eyes nations, those allies who are supposed to share intelligence with each other, the K activity or the Khalistani activity has gathered steam in all these nations. Can you put a finger to it? Why?
Well, most of the Indians, most of the Punjabis migrate to these Five Eye countries. So, and I mean, Dubai wouldn't allow these kinds of things. I'm sure they have different laws. Saudi Arabia may not allow these kinds of things. They have different laws. Yeah, Five Eyes have very similar laws right across the Five Eyes, and free, democratic, liberal societies where if I stand up and say I hate you, I'm allowed to say that. In some countries, I may not be allowed to say that. And I think that may be the difference. But in the politicians in all of these countries have been missing in action on the other question that I raised, where that is, hey guys, India is a friendly country. We don't support the dismemberment of a friendly country. So stop it, right? But nobody said that. And if even if they now start saying that, it would make a difference. It would make a difference.
But Ujjalji, Justin Trudeau can take a position of cooperation, rules-based order if he has acted in that manner. The door swings both ways. Foreign Minister Jaishankar, in plain speak at the UNGA, said that you have to first honor. It cannot be a one-way or selective choice. And territorial integrity, sovereignty cannot be based on selective whims and fancies. He also went on to say that political compulsions cannot drive a wedge or cannot become the cover fire for allowing extremists and terrorism.
Yeah, no, look, I totally agree. If there has been an extradition request and that request backed up by material evidence, supportable in terms of the law, if that evidence was presented to Canada and Canada did not proceed on that basis and didn't make any efforts to extradite the individual, then I think Canada is at fault. I don't know that the evidence was presented in a formal manner to have someone extradited. I know that there are two people that have been extradited recently from Canada, a brother and a sister who arranged the murder of the sister's daughter for marrying a cabbie in India. And they reached across the oceans and organized her murder. And they were extradited because India requested that extradition. So, if India properly asked for the extradition, I'd love to know. And perhaps then one can argue one way or the other.
Professor Hall, thank you. Thank you for joining us here on this edition of The Right Stand. My question to you is, how would you see and how do you read this current saga that's unfolding between India and Canada around Khalistani extremists?
Well, it's a very difficult situation. It's a difficult situation for India. Canada has got itself into a difficult situation too. And of course, there are other countries as well that are watching this all unfold, and they're watching it very closely.
But let me ask you, why is it that this entire Cape propaganda has flourished largely in the Five Eyes nations?
I think that's one of those kind of historical accidents. That's where the diaspora has spread. So we've got sizable Indian diasporas in each one of those countries. We've also got sizable Sikh diasporas, and of course the Sikh diaspora, takes up a bigger proportion of the diaspora as a whole overseas. So while it might be a very small population within India, it's a much larger population, in Australia, where I think the last count we had here in Australia, I reckon around 40% or so of our Indian diaspora comes from Punjab or from nearby, and many of those obviously are Sikh. So just as a result of that accident, and because of then the activism and some of the militancy that we've seen over the last couple of years, that's why it's concentrated in these places and perhaps not in other areas.
Why name India only, Professor Hall? Why not China? Operation Fox Hunt is running writ large on Canadian soil. The ISI is active. Karima Baloch was murdered, fingers pointing at the ISI. They didn't say anything when Ripudaman Malik was murdered.
Look, I don't think so. I think that, we've seen a major effort over 20 years by the United States, by Australia, and so on to really engage and build a very strong and robust relationship with India. It's been a little bit different for Canada. Canada's relationship with India is not as robust. It's not as broad. There's a lot of investment that comes from Canada into India. There's a lot of students that flow in the other direction as well. But they haven't got this broad-based relationship that we've endeavored in Australia and the United States has endeavored to build. I think that means that, the Canadians perhaps don't understand sometimes quite how New Delhi will respond and how the Indian public will respond when these kinds of disputes blow up. So I think there's something that Canada needs to learn, in other words, about how some of the other countries have managed these disputes.
We have confirmation from those who were part of the Trudeau establishment in the past that there was an alert, there were indications of Sikh extremists there and this kind of activity on Canadian soil, but Justin Trudeau didn't do anything about it. Are his days numbered as Prime Minister of Canada?
So that's a really interesting question as well, and one that I'm not an expert on Canadian politics, so it's a little bit difficult for me to answer. I think Trudeau, as you say, his poll ratings have been declining over time. Both his foreign policy, his national security policy, have not been as successful as some might like, and so there may well be a push, but I think it will come internally from his own party to potentially replace him as leader if somebody can be found. But that doesn't change the kind of fundamental underlying dynamic here, which is that Indian diaspora votes, and particularly those Sikh votes out in British Columbia and other parts of Canada, do matter. And given the Canadian electoral system, they kind of have a greater weight, if you like, than they might do in other kinds of systems.
Final question. Sitting in Australia, how do you see Bharat's approach to this entire issue so far?
Look, I think India's official responses in terms of what Mr. Jaishankar has been saying, or Dr. Jaishankar has been saying, in terms of what the Ministry of External Affairs has been saying, has been reasonably measured. I think that what the rest of us are asking now is, what is India going to do next? And that will depend obviously on what Canada's next steps are and the kinds of information that it wants to release. So I think we're not through this crisis, and I think we're all watching carefully to see how it develops.
Thank you for your views, and thank you for joining us on this very special broadcast. With that, we call it a wrap on this edition of The Right Stand.